Hi again, everybody, and welcome to a special Hacks and Flacks edition of Newsmakers TV. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Thursday, June 26, 2025. And when you work as a political reporter and you go to a convention or any kind of event, there's often something called a Hacks and Flacks dinner, where those people who work on campaigns and those who cover them get together to break bread and insult each other and tell lies. So I'm delighted to welcome to the program someone who's both a hack and a flack, also a former Santa Barbaran journalist and political operative, Chris Marr. How you doing, Chris?
Good. Still got my 805 area code.
You do. That's right.
I just need to get back there so it means something.
Well, folks in Santa Barbara may remember you for the 7 years you worked as a reporter for the Independent and the departed Daily Sound, managing to earn a law degree in your spare time while you washed windows with your third hand. And then, of course, you made a fatal move to the dark side with your first job in politics, working for former Representative Lois Capps. And after that, your career really took off. You had big jobs in Colorado, Montana. You became the national press secretary for the presidential campaign of Pete Buttigieg. Then you went to Washington with the Biden administration, worked in the Transportation Department, the Department of Defense, and of course, as White House Deputy Press Secretary. So, Chris, I'm beginning to think you can't hold a job.
Yeah, it was when you join the administration, you have to fill out what they call an SF-86 for your background check and clearance and all that, and you got to go back 10 or 15 years or something with every address you lived at. And it was it was a lot more work than
There's a long list.
yeah, a lot of racking my brain of where I've lived over the last decade. And yeah, to your point, I actually have received feedback from like job recruiters who are wondering why, some of these stints were so short, but that's the nature of politics is come election day,
Yeah,
you move on one way or the other.
but you're speaking from Washington now, though. You sort of more or less settled there.
Yeah, that's right. We moved here at the beginning of the administration and been here about 4 years. So
Okay. All right. Well, look, there's a lot I want to talk about politics and governments going on, but before we do that, just say a word, if you would, about your personal journey. I mean, why would you, first of all, want to leave the fabulously lucrative field of print journalism for politics? How did that odyssey go?
Man, I love being a reporter and working at the Santa Barbara Independent in particular. I actually just had coffee yesterday with Marianne Partridge, who was in town with her grandkids. So it was fun to catch up with her. But I
She
love
try to hire you back?
no comment. Uh, yeah, I loved the Independent and just being in Santa Barbara, and I loved the community that always just helped support the Independent because it was such a news focused community and people cared what was going on in town and around the country. But it was just kind of that time in my life where, I was thinking about what I was going to do next and where I was going to do it. And it wasn't necessarily, I'm going to get into politics, but, Congresswoman Capps was looking for a press secretary at the same time that I was kind of having these thoughts. And Washington had always been in the back of my mind. It was also right as I was finishing law school, so that was coming to an end. So there was kind of just a convergence of moments, and I decided to give it a shot. Obviously, Congresswoman Capps had a great reputation and was a great boss to work for, and that's what moved me out to DC. And since then, have been on the journey that you sort of laid out. So.
But you did have politics in your blood. You are, I believe, descended from a governor of Montana.
That's right. Thomas Francis Marr. I've never been able to figure out. Somebody told me he was my great, 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 great uncle. But I've never been able to verify if that was true or not. So I try not to push it too hard.
So
But
not a close family.
yeah, he was the first territorial governor of Montana. There's a statue of him out front of the Montana State Capitol. So it actually was pretty fun when I went out to Montana to work for Senator Tester for a couple of years. There was a Marr County, and like I just said, there's a statue of Thomas Francis Marr outside the Capitol. It was like the one place in the country that I've moved to where people knew how to pronounce my last name because it has a lot of extra letters in it.
Yeah,
Um,
they probably get a pretty good restaurant reservation.
yeah,
And toast,
they had a
man.
Marr Day.
And the other point, I read something that you wrote for the alumni magazine from Santa Barbara College of the Law about
Oh
getting a
man.
law degree, and I could never figure out what the hell you were doing, but um, but it was like you don't have to be a lawyer to do that. I mean, it just gives you a way of thinking and a way of writing and a way of it gives you an opening into multiple work areas.
Yeah, I think that's right. I do reflect on that time and wonder what I also wonder what I was doing. Uh, but I like to think that the law degree did come in handy in my subsequent career. I even took the bar because I just wanted to do it then while I was sort of fresh, and so I am barred in California if I need to like have my good wife moment or something, and find something to do. But yeah, it allows you to sort of think through things analytically and critically, and sort of think on your feet. And I've found it to be useful every once in a while. I even remember a bit of a law that becomes relevant in whatever the work is that I'm doing. But generally speaking, my best piece of legal advice I have for people is to find somebody else to be your lawyer.
Well, there was a time, you could have joined my legal team and the three most dread words in the English language, but
Yeah.
fortunately that's gone. So after the Buttigieg campaign of 2020, he of course endorsed President Biden. He went to transportation department. I mean, he only stayed there about a minute because then they summoned you over to the White House. They had a little problem there going on with
Yeah.
somebody else. What did that feel like? You're like, wait a minute, I signed up to talk about trains here. What is this?
Yeah, no, it was really something. And frankly, so I joined back up with Pete in November, basically after the election, to help him through kind of the cabinet selection process and that sort of thing, because there were a ton of rumors floating about who was going into what slot and all of that. So I helped him kind of manage that process, and then wasn't really intending to go into the Department of Transportation, but he called me kind of the week of the inauguration and asked if I would join him there. And so I said yes. Um, and so I missed about the first week of the administration, but got up and running the first week of February. And then, yeah, one of the deputy press secretaries who went into the White House initially got into a little bit of a kerfuffle with a reporter, and ended up getting let go pretty early on. And uh, I just got a text from Jen Psaki one day, and she basically laid out like, as you're probably tracking, we have a job opening, and if you're interested, it's basically yours. I'd love to have a conversation. And she had already kind of laid some of the groundwork and had reached out to Pete to have that conversation to make sure that she wasn't stepping out of turn and snagging me away from him too quickly. So which I really appreciated. And I think Pete recognized that it was a great opportunity for me, and probably helpful for him to have me over at the White House. So yeah, and this is all during COVID, right? So I went into the office at the Department of Transportation twice, one day to pick up my computer, and then to turn it in. So I did check out my office, but I never actually like worked out of my office.
Did you work out of the White House though when you went over there?
Yeah, so the White House, we worked every day, and had to mask up. And at that point, the press briefings were only 12 reporters. Like they had a rotating pool of reporters, so everybody was seated, 3 or 4 seats away. And my office at the White House which, not everybody gets an office at the White House, and I had a window and everything. But it was about the size of my kitchen table. And so, when I had reporter, it was right, I shared a wall with the briefing room. So the blue wall behind the press secretary, right on the other side of that was my office. And so reporters, throughout the course of the day would come into the office. That was one place where they had access to. And so then there were two of you during COVID, in this like basically cubby hole, both wearing masks. And it wasn't necessarily a lot of fun to wear a mask, but we went in every single day for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't want to talk too much about the Biden administration, but of course, there has been much comment in recent weeks about this book, Original Sin, and everybody knew that Biden was, too old and to this and to that. Well, just give me your take on that book.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on the book in general. I think a lot of the reporting was pretty misguided. There were maybe kernels of truth that they heard from places, but took those kernels of truth and jammed them into the narrative that they were trying to build about um, President Biden's time in office. My personal experience was that yes, he was old, right? Like, there's no denying that. But I don't think that prevented him from any decision making. I think that, I mean, if you had to go into the Oval Office and brief the guy, I don't think you would come out of that thinking that he was incapable of leading the free world. I mean, the guy was on top of his stuff. He read every briefing memo. He came to those meetings with a lot of questions and held your feet to the fire to make sure that the decisions that were being presented to him were being made appropriately and with the information that he needed to make the decision. And so, I think a lot of this is political. I think Republicans, generally speaking, think that it's a lot better to be talking about the past administration than it is about this horrible, awful bill that they're trying to ram through Congress right now and the impacts that it'll actually have on people. And so, a lot of this is political games, and I personally had an amazing experience at the White House. I think there could be an argument about whether he should have run again. I think people can have that conversation, but in terms of
That's a political argument.
yeah, in terms of his ability to do the job and the job that he actually done, I mean, just did. I would just say, look at his record, look at the things that we were able to get done and accomplish over the last 4 years.
Yeah. Um, I think I covered my first campaign in 1974, San Francisco School Board. So that 51 years, every single thing I thought I knew or that I assumed was true about politics and media and how things work and everything's been upended, obviously, by the Trump administration. You've been inside on this. You've done those briefings, you've seen those briefings, you've worked in the Department of Defense where we've seen a lot of briefings this week. I mean, what's your perspective? What do you think when you get up in the morning and look at your phone or see what's happened?
Uh, well, I feel exhausted, frankly. I think part of this administration's plan out of the gate was to cause a lot of chaos and confusion for the exact reason that I sort of just explained. I think to distract from some of the stuff that they are trying to jam down the throats of the American people. If there's just so much going on and so many things happening, it's easy to get distracted, and they do a good job of flooding the zone, holding press conferences and giving access to the president and the brief. There's a briefing going on right now with the press secretary. Right after the defense secretary this morning, and I think Donald Trump's going to have access to the press later today, right? So like they're just relentless in presenting themselves to the American public, and It's hard, I think, for our Democratic leaders. I think it's hard for the press. I think it's hard for everybody to try to keep up with it all. And it's easy to lose focus on the things that actually matter. It's easy to lose focus on what they're actually doing to impact the lives of the American people day to day, and um, it's hard to have a cohesive message in response to that, which I think is what Democrats are working through right
Well,
now.
yeah, and I mean that's one of the things. I mean, Trump is a David Axelrod says this all. I mean, he's a TV producer. So he's producing this daily reality TV show, and then you layer onto that social media and
Yeah,
speed with which information moves, and then recency bias, which is nobody can remember what happened yesterday, and
right.
it kind of all speeds along. And it's hard to find probably a bigger contrast to how he uses that media and how President Biden did. What do I mean when you have Democratic clients now? I mean, how do you advise them to navigate that? How do Democrats come back from that? How do they? I mean, how do they combat that?
No, I mean, I think the media ecosystem is just so complex and complicated. When I was at the White House, I used to think about it all the time, like what the job of the person who sat in my seat 20 or 30 years ago, what it must have been like for them, right? Because basically you had
Newsweek's on the line.
yeah. You had like your day-to-day schedule must have looked so much different, right? Where you have the evening news and the newspaper deadlines are probably around the same time, right? The early evening. And then you're good until the next morning with the morning shows, and then you go through that process again, and then your next deadline is kind of 5, 6, 7 o'clock somewhere in there. And whereas here it's like we were responding to tweets, and I had cable reporters coming in and saying like, hey, I'm going on TV in 5 minutes, like what do I need to say to sound smart, and like get me up to speed on this sort of stuff. And it was just unrelenting because it's coming at you from every direction. Now we're having sort of this conversation about longer form pieces and people who aren't even really journalists, but um, have podcasts that are listened to by millions and millions and millions of people. Whereas, like, your highest rated show on CNN probably reaches 800, maybe 900,000 people, The television evening news, the CBS, NBC, ABC, their evening news shows still reach millions of people, but not nearly as many as they used to. People don't get their news and information in the same way that they used to, and we have to be able to adapt to that. And so for me, it's kind of an all of the above strategy. We're never going to be able to ignore, CNN and ABC and NBC and Fox News because they still reach a segment of the population and they still reach an important chattering class that sort of, generates momentum and buzz and all of that sort of stuff. But if you're actually trying to reach voters, where they are in the country, I don't know who said it, but somebody said politics is downstream from culture, right? And a lot of people,
Breitbart. Breitbart.
yeah, 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 yeah. And a lot of people are explicitly staying away from politics, but they're still listening to Joe Rogan or Theo Vaughn or Call Me Daddy or whatever that podcast is, where they're not explicitly talking about politics, but it seeps into the conversation. They have guests on there that are sometimes political. And so we need to exist in those spaces, or we need to figure out a way to influence those conversations. And so the media ecosystem is more fractured than ever, and it's more complicated than ever. And I think we're really trying to figure out how do we get into those spaces? And one of the big things we need are people who can communicate. You can't just pop onto, when I'm preparing a client for CNN, it's going to be a 7 minute segment, 8 minute segment. You're going to get 5 or 6 questions. Here's the news of the day. Here's what they want to, you're going on for a reason, right? So they're going to want to talk to you about this. blah, 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 blah. And more or less, you can sort of predict how the conversation is going to go. You go on a 3 hour podcast, you can't stick to your talking points the whole time, right? And chances are you're going to be talking about stuff that you're not necessarily comfortable about, not haven't maybe spent a lot of time thinking about. Have to be able to communicate regardless, or else it's going to be a dud of an interview, or you're going to say something stupid, or worse, you know? And so you have to have people who can sort of excel at that and actually communicate in those spaces as well, and not just be stuck to political talking points.
Well, do you agree that with the critique that Democrats just generally have been much too cautious about that? I mean, Buttigieg and you and your colleague Liz Smith famously, in 2020 and his president, go everywhere. And he's
Yeah.
good at it. I mean, send Pete to Fox, can
Yeah.
anybody else go to Fox? No, only
Yeah.
Pete can go to Fox. Um, and then, during the Harris campaign, you have this endless, oh, will she go on Joe Rogan or won't she? Or she's going to go on this, and Trump's just everywhere.
Yeah.
He doesn't care. He'll talk to anyone about anything. Um, and then I think looking at, just to bring it up to speed today, the New York City mayor's race, where Mondami did the same kind of thing. He was everywhere. I mean, is that a sort of a category difference between Democrats and Republicans, or just a media strategy, or how would
Yeah,
you?
I think so. No, I mean, if you recall in 2019 or during the 2020 campaign, it might have been 2020, but I think it was 2019, Bernie Sanders went on Joe Rogan's show and got absolutely slaughtered by Democrats because of some of the things that Joe Rogan had said on his podcast in the past, you know? And I think we as a party just need to move past some of that and understand like we have to communicate in these spaces. Just because you go on Joe Rogan's show doesn't mean you're endorsing everything that he's ever said in the past. Just because Pete goes on Fox News or he did Flagrant podcast, which is sort of in this bro-sphere podcast world. And he sat down for 3 hours. It wasn't, some of it was a little on the spicy side, but he got through it. It was a great episode. And we estimate that we reached through clips and other cuts of the episode, not the entire episode, but, segments of the episode reached 75 million people. That one 3 hour uh, use of Pete's time and his voice was reaching 75 million people, and probably a huge segment of the population that had never even heard of Pete or certainly heard from him. One thing that he says all the time is we can't expect people to uh, go along with our message or understand our message if they've never heard it in the first place, right? They're not going to be on our side if they don't even know what we're saying. And so we really have to get out there. But I do think, to your point, we were too cautious in 2024 about and probably as a party just too cautious generally when we're considering where to go. And I think it goes back to making sure that we have candidates and elected officials who can go into those places, communicate effectively, and be rational and reasonable in what they're actually saying, so that they can actually connect with those audiences.
Yeah, and I guess critics of Democrats would say, well, that's because you're so afraid of offending any of the 873 interest groups, that are so significant to the Democratic Party. That there's this caution built in because you don't want to say the wrong word or take the wrong stance on anything at all. When you look at the 2024 election, which was obviously a disaster for Democrats um, at every level, although I do have been trying to point out it wasn't exactly a landslide for Trump.
Yeah.
Do you think it was basically a messaging communications problem, or was it a policy substance problem?
I think it's more of a messaging substance problem. I mean, I've seen some data out there that, I think there's little question that economic issues were the number one uh, issue in the campaign, right? Lowering the cost of goods and how much things cost and access to jobs and that sort of thing, whatever you want to kind of lump into the economy.
Economic
Immigra
anxiety. Yeah.
yeah, immigration was also, high on the list. And most people thought that Republicans were focused on those two issues as their top issues. Uh, at least some focus groups, when people ask what the Democratic Party was focused on, it was like cultural issues or LGBT issues or other issues, which, yes, we care about those issues, but those aren't the top issues that the Democratic Party stands for. The Democratic Party should, like, people should know and understand that we are the party of the working class and workers, right? We are the ones focused on making things more affordable for people. And that just wasn't resonating with people this last election. Part of it is because Republicans were and Donald Trump was so effective at driving that point home. And part of it was our own fault for not having a coherent message, especially on immigration, I think, but certainly on economic issues. And I think you're seeing a lot of people kind of struggle through that right now as a party, which gets me back to the earlier point about just sort of the chaos and confusion, getting us distracted as a party where we have to respond to everything that Donald Trump is saying and doing instead of just being laser focused on what we know voters and the American people care about the most. And that's their ability to put food on their kids' plate, their ability to get health insurance that's going to pay for, hospital visits and doctor visits, that they can afford to put gas in their car and get to work, or that the bus is going to get them where they need to go in a timely manner. Like these very basic kitchen table issues that are impacting people's lives every single day, as opposed to whatever Donald Trump wants you to focus on in this particular day. So
But
that's what we're
you,
trying to do right now.
yeah, and but you read these stories, and they're becoming ubiquitous. It's like here's a Trump voter in Arkansas who voted for Trump, and now he's runs an auto parts store, and it's costing him too much because of the tariffs, but I'd still vote for him. Or the immigrant a waitress who got hauled off by ICE. Everybody knew her. She was here for 20 years. That's terrible. I didn't think they were going to do that, but I'd vote for him again. I mean, what is it that is Trump's attraction there, do you think?
It's a good question. I think part of it is um, Democrats can't just show what we're against. We have to show what we're for. And I think a lot of these people might not see the Democratic Party or Democratic candidates as like a viable alternative, right? Maybe that person down in Arkansas is feeling a little bit of pain, but he still thinks that Donald Trump is the best person to get him out of that pain because he knows that the Democrat, is not going to help him get out of that pain. We have to be able to offer a viable alternative that sells with the American people and that they understand and that they trust. And I just don't think that we've really gotten there as a party quite yet.
I have enough dread and anxiety that there's certain things I can't think about. And one is whether or not we're actually going to have presidential election in 2028. So put that aside. Uh, if we do have a presidential election, who do you? I mean, obviously you're still connected to Pete Buttigieg, and I assume if he runs, you would be with him. But just put your strategist hat on. For a second and give me a word, if you would, about Pete, about Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, J.D. Pritzker, others that would come to mind as possible candidates.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those names that you just sort of laid out, obviously, or maybe not obviously, but I also worked for Governor Whitmer back in 2020 after Pete dropped out. I happened to find myself in Michigan, and which is my home state originally,
Go
and
Spartans.
yeah, exactly. Go green. Uh, so I ended up working for her for several months, and I loved it. And I love her, and I think she's a total badass. And you know, uh, she actually got a lot of heat for essentially working with Trump earlier in the year on a few issues that were important to the state of Michigan. And my personal take on that in particular, as people feel like they need to fight and stand up to Trump and all of that sort of stuff, the governor's job is to get stuff done for the state that they represent, right? And if that means working with Donald Trump sometimes, as icky as that feels, if you're gonna like save 6,000 jobs in your state and have an economic impact of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, then you're going to do that, you know? And I just didn't really, I understand at its
Well, it was that
core.
moment in the White House where he is railing against, he's going to, investigate, these guys who said that the 20,
Yeah.
and she's covering her face. I mean, that had to be a great moment
So,
for her communications guy.
and I think, w would she, if she could have that moment back, would she be standing there? Certainly not. But I also think that she probably didn't know that that was necessarily going to play out that way. I don't know that she signed herself up to do an open press, Oval Office gaggle with the president. I think that was sort of sprung on her. So I think she was at the White House to have a few meetings. But what I was getting around to saying is, you see that work paying off. And she has like a 65% approval rating in the state of Michigan. And now she has like some concrete examples of how she's gotten stuff done for her constituents. She still has plenty of examples of holding Donald Trump's feet to the fire, including while I was there. And she still has plenty of time to continue to do that. But if she didn't take the opportunity to work with him to get that stuff for the state of Michigan, then she wouldn't be doing her job. So I think she's great. I think she would be a great candidate. I think she's savvy. She is one of those people who can step into a lot of different situations and communicate very effectively with different folks. I think we have a great bench, honestly. I think we have a great slate of candidates. It's going to be really interesting to see, who gets in the race and who decides to pass and who thinks it's their moment or not. But I think regardless, we're going to have a lot of really solid candidates who will result in a sort of very active primary and let the cream kind of rise to the top. So,
Well, speaking of governors who are trying to find their way through this minefield, Gavin Newsom, famously decided he would be a podcast bro for about a week, and now he's back to leading the resistance. And he tried to be nice during the fires. I mean, what do you make of how he's doing?
yeah, I think people want to see a fighter, right? They want to see somebody standing up to Donald Trump. Uh, um, I personally am not sure that I would have recommended the approach that they've sort of taken to stoop to some of the levels that they are with sort of their rapid response and their memes and like a lot of this stuff is very serious and it's having a really serious impact on people's lives. And I think it's okay to call that out. I think it's okay to be firm and strong, but uh, some of the ways that they're using their social media accounts, um, it's just not sort of a tone or a tact that I would necessarily um, uh,
No matter what
that I would
Trump
take.
says or what he calls you or anything,
Yeah,
just
I think there are ways to be effective otherwise. I think, the podcast it's an interesting idea, but I mean, listening to it, you he has interesting guests on, but listening to it, you know, you would like to see in those moments him being ready to push back on some of those guests and what they're saying rather than giving them a platform to just say whatever they want. Or even worse, in my opinion, praise them for some of the work that they did, like he did with Charlie Kirk. So, um, I think if you're gonna hold the opposition to feet to the fire, then you should do it, and you need to do it in all settings.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is serious stuff, and that's the problem is that it just tends to that it's like it's all entertainment, and all you have to do is look at what's going on at the Pentagon this week. What could be more serious than
Yeah.
attacking Iran? That was kind of one of your old jobs was briefing at the Pentagon, and then you look at this clown show that's out there this week. I mean, what are you thinking when you watch that?
I mean, it's discouraging, honestly. The Pentagon was the hardest job that I've ever had, but it was also the most fulfilling and I think uh, best job that I've ever had, being able to work directly with the men and women who have signed up to serve their country, not because Donald Trump is president or Joe Biden is president or Barack Obama or George Bush or whoever. They swore an oath to the Constitution to defend our freedom because they believe in what the United States is. And uh, it almost feels cheesy to say sometimes, but I just loved working with. It was refreshing to work with men and women who were there, not focused on politics, but focused on the mission. And to see a press conference like the one that Pete Hegseth held this morning, all political, and clearly was done because Donald Trump was pissed off about this CNN story that contradicted what they had been saying. Um, and directed the Pentagon to hold a press briefing, even though they didn't really have any details additional to share at this time. And so what they had to do was go out and bash the media and puff their chests and use a lot of bluster and big words and adjectives to make them sound really cool. And he didn't say anything of substance in that press briefing. And part of the problem is because of what led up to it and the night of the Iran strikes, the rhetoric that the president used and the rhetoric that Hegseth was using the next morning about total obliteration. We just don't know what happened. And it's okay to say that and say that it's going to take time. Praise the men and women who conducted the strike. It was a enormously dangerous and complex mission flying over Iranian airspace to in the first time ever drop those bunker buster bombs. Like this wasn't an easy mission, and there has been a lot of reporting about that, and they are rightfully praising the men and women who executed the mission. But to talk about this as total obliteration and we've knocked out the nuclear program. It's simply not true. There's not going to be a military solution to Iran's nuclear program. That's going to happen uh, diplomatically and at the negotiating table. There's too much information. There's too many resources spread throughout Iran. There's too many people who know how to conduct this type of business that you can't just drop a few bombs and end their nuclear program. That's just not how it works. But I think what uh, it all starts with the president's rhetoric, right? I mean, he complicated it in the weeks leading up to this strike. He called for this 2 week pause where he would make the decision within 2 weeks, which was clearly a ruse. Uh, sure, to lull Iran into complacency, yes, I get. But he also misled the American people. He probably confused people in the Pentagon. He misled Congress, and now he's paying the price for all of that. There's a way to conduct business that can be orderly and make sense, and it doesn't all have to be done on Truth Social or Twitter or social media to execute effectively. So, when you have Donald Trump, who, to your earlier point, is an entertainer, you have Pete Hegseth, who, his background and experience is on the round couch of Fox and Friends Weekend Edition. This is what you're left with.
Yeah, and you had a feel for General Kane in that moment, who there,
Yeah, you could
is,
almost tell he was uncomfortable. Um, he like again, the men and women serving in our United States military are not political, and they're being used more and more uh, for political reasons. And I'm not here to say that Democrats never use the military politically. There's a fine line, and sometimes it gets crossed, and sometimes it's hard to know where the line is, and it's not perfect, right? But to intentionally put our service members in those tough positions uh, um, and insert them automatically into politics, I think is just wrong.
Well, and this is way out of my area of expertise, and you may not be comfortable answering it, but I mean, he fired all those generals, that seemed to have been a targeted group. I mean, how concerned are you? Because Trump's obviously in the last couple of weeks trying to make the military his Praetorian Guard. He had that spectacle down
Yeah,
at
Fort
Fort
Bragg.
Bragg, and then the
Yeah.
stupid parade that he had. Um, and you've mentioned the professionalism of the military, and that's been one of the things since the founders that we had, kind of a professional military. How concerned are you that he'll be successful in this?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. You hear Hegseth, talking about war fighting and lethality, and they're just like the buzzwords that he goes to over and over and over. It's almost as if like the men and women of the United States the United States military is the most capable, biggest, baddest military that has ever existed in the history of the world. And it didn't just start on January 21st, 2025. It's been that way for a long time. But these guys are pretending like the men and women who have been there for decades had nothing to do with getting us to this point, and that all of a sudden now we're lethal, now we're ready to fight wars and that sort of thing. And I think, going back to the people who got fired, I knew several of those people. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, CQ Brown, he was a fighter pilot. He served for 40 years or so. He flew missions like into the hundreds and thousands of hours in an airplane, He's not just a guy who sat behind his desk the entire life. Like we're talking about American heroes. One of the senior military aide to the secretary who he let go, she was a three-star general. Probably the baddest, most experienced female pilot in the history of the United States Air Force. That he just said, move along. And why? There was no explanation given. They didn't even announce that they fired her. You do see, despite this like focus on warfighting and lethality, you do also in action see uh, them taking steps to eliminate people from the ranks, whether it's people of color or women or trans, service members. And I think that's all pretty intentional. On the trans issue, if somebody is willing to give their life for this country, and we're going to say no to them serving their country, it's baffling to me that is the direction that they have decided to go. So, yes, it's very discouraging to see what's unfolding here. And I mean, we haven't even touched on half of it, of what's sort of unfolded, but it's a very dangerous, tenuous time at DoD. And I think there are a lot of people who are really worried about what's going on over there.
Yeah. Hey, you've been so generous with your time, but I mean, I do have to ask you after what you just said. I mean, you're a young guy. I mean, are you hopeful? Are you despairing? What's your state of mind? You're living there in the belly of the beast in Washington. I mean, where do you think we are as a country?
Yeah, it's it's a good question. I think just kind of sitting here and watching the news, it's hard to believe it's been, 130 or 140 days into this administration and we're only 10% through or whatever it might be. It feels exhausting and like we got a long way to go. But I mean, you know, I I do still have a lot of hope. I have a lot of hope in the men and women who are serving our country. You know, their jobs are not easy even on the best days, but they're certainly not easy now. And but I feel deep down that when push comes to shove, they will do the right thing, you know, and that gives me hope. Some of those leaders that you talked about and that we talked about a little bit, they give me hope. You know, I think we have a lot of really compelling people who I know because I've experienced it firsthand care very much about their communities, care very much about the direction of this country, and care very much about solving some of the complicated issues that are before us. That doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that it's not exhausting to live through. And it doesn't mean that we can't, you know, we got to stay on our tippy toes. And it's going to take everybody. It's going to take people like the groups that were out in Santa Barbara and across the world a couple Saturdays ago, making their voices heard, you know. It's got to take the people who are making their voices heard now on this big, beautiful bill that's making its way through the Senate, to make sure that people understand what that actually means for people who rely on things like Medicaid for health insurance. So it's not easy, but it's important that people keep that hope and keep working towards a more hopeful future, I think. So
All right. Well, Chris Marr, who made his bones as a flack and a hack in Santa Barbara, has gone on to greater things. We knew you when. Listen, I appreciate you doing this, man. I hope you come back sometime, and maybe we can catch up in 6 months or so and see. We'll be 20% of the way through it then.
that's right.
Maybe, maybe things will improve, have
Yeah.
improved by then. But thank you so much, Chris, for doing this, and good luck.
All right. Thanks, Jerry.